Millennials, people in my generation, around my age range, are generally worse off than previous generations in a multitude of ways. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. First of all, we're inheriting a rigged economy that disproportionately benefits elites and the rich. We are also inheriting a dying planet that we have to be the ones to save if we even want to have a future at all. And when I talk about these things, when I talk about the economic woes that plague the millennial generation, I'm not just being hyperbolic, because the Young Invincibles, which is a DC-based think tank, actually crunched the numbers and found that millennials earn approximately $10,000 less annually than baby boomers, which is a 20% change overall. Now, additionally, Young Invincibles also found that declines in education levels have changed so drastically between now and then that, quote, young people today that have a degree with debt earn roughly the same as young workers with no degree in the late 1980s. And that's problematic, but it's not just that our degrees are worth less today than they were back then. But additionally, as Cheat Sheet explains, on average, millennials pay 150% more in tuition than baby boomers. So we pay more for our degrees that are worth less. And it's not just education. The average cost of weddings went up by 24%. The cost to purchase a home increased by 294%. And the cost of food has also increased substantially, even when accounting for inflation. Also, contrary to popular belief, millennials are not lazy. We are now the largest generation in the US labor force, and productivity continues to increase even though we have a very large presence. However, wages have not kept up with productivity, meaning we're working harder for lower wages generally speaking, and prices keep increasing. So our generation undoubtedly has it harder than previous generations. That's not to say that different generations didn't have other problems that were pretty prevalent, but our generation, economically at least, is much worse off, and the future doesn't look very bright for a lot of us. However, when we complain about these things, we're often labeled as entitled millennials who want it all. We're called lazy, and the reason why, we aren't making as much money as our parents is because we just don't want to work very hard. And a lot of people seem to have this anti-millennial rhetoric, and they blame us for everything. I mean, look at all of the anti-millennial articles that are constantly being written. I mean, it just goes to show overall that older generations hate millennials, even if it's the case that, we're not responsible for the current situation. We're just now entering it. Now, one individual in particular who, interestingly enough, seems to have the same type of anti-millennial stance is former Vice President Joe Biden. And he actually has some really harsh words for millennials who dared to speak out about our current situation. And before I tell you what he said, let me just remind you that this is an individual that is presumably going to be running for president in 2020. So if there's any generation he needs to guarantee a win, it's going to be us. So keep that in mind and listen to what he has to say about our generation.
I only had two political heroes in my whole life. And this is not new. I've said this since 1972. Dr. King and Robert Kennedy. And up to that point, there was a war raging. There was a bitter fight over even whether we should talk about the environment. Women were still viewed as second-class citizens and not prepared to have significant jobs, thought that. And we were told the people didn't talk to one another over the war. And we were told, drop out, go out to Haight-Ashbury, get engaged. Shortly after I graduated in '68, Kent State, 17 kids shot dead. And so the younger generation now tells me how tough things are. Give me a break. No. I have no empathy for it. Give me a break. Because here's the deal, guys. We decided we were going to change the world, and we did. We did. We finished the civil rights movement to the first stage. The women's movement came into being. So my message is, get involved. There's no place to hide. You can go out and you can make all the money in the world, but you can't build a wall high enough to keep the pollution out. You can't live where you're you can't not be diminished when your sister can't marry the man or woman or the woman she loves. You can't, when you have a good friend being profiled, you can't escape this stuff.
So if that doesn't tell you that Joe Biden is out of touch, I don't think anything will. I mean, let's go back to the quotes here. The younger generation now tells me how tough things are. Give me a break. I have no empathy. Give me a break. Because here's the deal, guys. We decided we were going to change the world, and we did. My message is get involved. Now, I don't even know where to begin. First and foremost, what did you do specifically, Joe Biden? Were you out there fighting for civil rights? Because I remember Bernie Sanders fighting for civil rights and being arrested because he was leading a march to desegregate the University of Chicago. But for some reason, I don't see any pictures of you protesting when you were younger, Joe. So how involved were you exactly? Now, second of all, we can't ignore the conservative undertones there, because basically the implication is that, well, if your situation is tough, then pull yourself up by your bootstraps. What does that sound like to you? That sounds like a conservative type of philosophy. It really puts the individual at the center of one's economic issues. So that way, if there are economic problems, if the aggregate economy isn't functioning for normal Americans, well, that's not necessarily the economy's fault and, Congress's fault. That's your fault for not doing enough to pull yourself out of this difficult situation. That's the implication. And Joe Biden specifically really has a lot of nerve saying this when he personally is responsible for worsening our situation. So he actually helped to exacerbate the student debt crisis at the behest of his donors, the big banks. Now, as journalist David Sirota explained in an interview with Amy Goodman for Democracy Now!, quote, there was a push in the 1970s to say that students would have to wait 5 years from graduating to be able to seek bankruptcy protections for their government loans. That was a bill that Joe Biden helped craft. He was on the conference committee. There was a series of other bills through the 1980s and into the 1990s in which Joe Biden worked on the same set of issues, lengthening the amount of time students would have to wait to be able to access bankruptcy protections for educational debt. And then into the late 1990s and 2000s, there was this push by Biden. He was a key Democrat pushing the bankruptcy bill that was ultimately signed by President George W. Bush that eliminated the ability of most Americans to seek bankruptcy protections, not only for their government loans, but also for their private student loans. So that was a big objective of the private lenders. At the time, over his career, Joe Biden has raised about $2 million from the financial sector while he's been sculpting these bills. So here he is hypocritically blaming us for our situation, blaming us for not buying cars or houses, blaming us for complaining about our student debt situation when he helped make this situation worse for us. So he's telling us to stop whining. He has no empathy for us because if we're tired of this political situation, then we need to get involved and change it. Yet, he crafted the situation in this country that has made it so bad for millennials to begin with. And furthermore, he's telling us that getting involved would presumably help us improve our own situation. But what was it again that his party did in 2016 when millennials came out in droves to vote for Bernie Sanders? He sat by and was silent as his party, the DNC, brazenly rigged the primary against Bernie Sanders, the candidate that millennials overwhelmingly supported. And guess what? If you hadn't have done that, Bernie Sanders very well could have won, and we would now have a President Bernie Sanders, not a President Donald Trump. So we tried to make our voices clear, and we were silenced by the DNC, yet neoliberals and centrist Democrats still blamed us because we didn't come out and vote. I bet more people would come out and vote if they actually felt like the process was fair to begin with. But the question is, what is Joe Biden doing now? Because he did all of that in the past. He pushed for the bankruptcy bill in the past. But what is he currently doing to rectify the situation and make millennials feel better about the economy and the Democratic Party in general? Well, he's now positioning himself as the anti-Bernie of 2020.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
And of course, additionally, he's saying things like this about millennials.
I have no empathy for it. Give me a break.
So in the end, I don't even know what to say about this. Joe Biden is doing the exact opposite of what he should be doing. He's showing that he is less politically astute than Hillary Clinton, because even though Hillary Clinton had no clue how to run even a moderately competent campaign, she at least knew that she had to get millennials to support her if she wanted to win. Joe Biden is showing I don't really care about millennials. It seems like, they just need to stop crying and pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and then things will be better for them. I know that he thinks that we're going to hear him say that and be like, oh, thank you. I guess we just needed someone to give us a kick in the ass to get us going and to stop complaining and to actually do something. But that's not the way that this works, Joe. You are fundamentally misunderstanding the situation. You're ignoring the part you played that got us to this current economic situation to begin with. So I don't even understand what Joe Biden was thinking to say something like this, to blast millennials as he's about to announce his presidential campaign in about a year. I mean, what gives, Joe? I mean, this just shows that he's completely out of touch with our generation and Americans in general, because it's not just millennials who are struggling. It's the working class in general of all generations, and that's what's important. So I don't necessarily want to imply that millennials are more important and that I care more about my generation than other generations. I think that together we need to cultivate this class consciousness that's been missing in this country and realize that the working class is getting screwed over by people like Joe Biden.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.